1 week into a US-led bombing campaign in Syria, how much closer are President Obama and his allies to defeating ISIL? And are some opposition groups in Syria now turning against the US? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, in the early days of Syria's civil war, opposition activists and fighters pleaded with the US to strike the Syrian government. They wanted help to turn the tide against President Bashar al-Assad's forces. Now, for the last week, the US and its allies have been carrying out bombings all over Syria, but against the group known as ISIL, not the government. Many of the opposition groups which called on the US to take action fear Obama has abandoned the goal of getting rid of Assad. The Syrian government has even welcomed the strikes as part of its efforts to fight what it calls terrorism.
It is high time, ladies and gentlemen, to pool our efforts against this terrorism, since imminent danger is surrounding everyone and no country is immune. My country was, and still is, firm in its position against terrorism, before this terrorism was rampant as it is currently. Mr. President, we in Syria respect our commitments and honour our promises. This is what we confirmed on more than one occasion, particularly since the beginning of the crisis in Syria.
Well, the perception that the US-led coalition may be inadvertently helping Assad has turned some groups against the strikes. Let me just show you this statement by the Islamic Front. That's a coalition of fighters that are actually against ISIL. But the statement describes the airstrikes as Western hypocrisy. It condemns the US-led coalition for not targeting the Syrian government, who they see as the biggest terrorist in Syria. Let's bring the guests into today's show then. In London, Lina Khatib, director of the Carnegie Middle East Centre in Beirut. Joining us on Skype in Herzliya, Israel, is Ayman Joad Al-Tamimi, a fellow at the Middle East Forum and specialist on ISIL and armed groups in Iraq and Syria. And in Washington, D.C., Lawrence Korb, former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense. Good to have you all with us. If I could start with Ayman in Herzliya. Are the airstrikes rallying fighting groups against ISIL to come together, or are they rallying groups to oppose the US-led coalition? What sort of effect is it having on the ground in Syria?
I think there are two things to understand. Firstly, that yes, the airstrikes are arousing opposition, but at the same time, one has to be very wary of this. Of these claims that, say, for example, the Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliate, is going to have a reconciliation with the Islamic State or ISIL. So there were some reports claiming that Nusra was supposedly holding war planning meetings with ISIL, but no, one should treat that with skepticism. I think reject it. They're two quite different things to reject the US airstrikes and then, on the other hand, to rally, say, and think about reconciling with ISIL. In the end, ISIL demands that other groups subsume themselves under ISIL's banner and pledge allegiance. So reconciliation in any form isn't really possible. But on the other hand,
so is anybody right now standing with ISIL in terms of the armed groups on the ground in Syria?
No, what you see is a narrative put out particularly by, say, Jabhat al-Nusra that betrays the effort as part of a wider war against Islam. And it should be noted, actually, in Iraq, there are other insurgent actors, for example, the Islamic Army in Iraq, that betray it in similar terms. However, they don't necessarily rally against ISIL. What I think you would instead see is that, say, US efforts to try to build a force on the ground to push back against ISIL would be severely hampered, because I think, in particular, in terms of manpower, I think the US would have to draw on, say, fighters who might come from the Islamic Front. But if they're opposing the airstrikes and they're angry about no coordination, they're angry about strikes against Nusra as well, then that's a problem.
All right, Lawrence, these strikes don't seem to be causing too many armed groups to rush into the arms of ISIL, but are they alienating other armed factions, some of the most important or strongest armed factions on the ground, away from Western and Arab governments as a result. That statement which I read out from the Islamic Front seems to indicate that even groups which are against ISIL are now feeling even more alienated from the West.
Well, in the short term, you may have that, but the real problem in the short term is ISIL, because you have to prevent them from expanding as they have into Iraq and keep weakening them so that they don't cause problems on the Turkish border. Once you've done that, then you can begin to work with other groups to deal with the question of Assad. But I think in the short term, there's no doubt about the fact that you can't please everybody, and the United States and its coalition partners, who are flying about 1/4 of the airstrikes, basically want to deal with the threat from ISIL.
All right, Lena, is that scenario actually, or that strategy actually working right now, where the pressure on ISIL is sort of the immediate short-term goal, but there will be a chance, or there is a chance, for any vacuum to be filled by other opposition groups rather than by the regime itself?
I think the strategy, if we can call it a strategy, for me, it's not a strategy, it's simply a plan. It's simply not working. To think that you can first extract ISIL and then deal with the power vacuum in Syria is just fanciful. You have to work on two tracks in parallel, meaning you have to have a military strategy that goes beyond airstrikes to tackle ISIL and other extremist groups. And at the same time, you have to have a political strategy that would, from now, start planning for what happens in Syria once ISIL is eradicated. And I'm also very skeptical about being able to eradicate ISIL full stop, because it's so embedded within the civilian population in Syria and Iraq that it's going to be very difficult to detach these groups from ISIL and get them on board politically further down the line. I think you should start working on that right now if anyone is going to have a chance of stabilizing Syria further.
Well, Lena, isn't the US doing that with announcements that they're beefing up support to some factions of the opposition? We hear of perhaps covert US operations going on to train Syrian opposition groups in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia and other places. Isn't there a broader plan, or is that not broad enough?
Right now, all the support that is being given to the Syrian opposition is in the form of military support. We're seeing training in Jordan, training planned in Saudi Arabia, but first, this training is not at a level that is high enough to enable the moderate Syrian opposition, mainly the Free Syrian Army, to actually overwhelm ISIL or the Syrian regime. And second, we have a glaring gap when it comes to the political side of the Syrian opposition. They seem to be out of the picture. They seem to be quite skeptical about the coalition because they feel ignored. So I don't see a role for them in the current plan by the coalition, unfortunately, and this is a big mistake.
All right, I want to pick up on that point with Lawrence in a second, but Ayman, the whole story of Syria started off as a story of some kind of popular revolution or revolt against what was seen as a very oppressive government. What about the human suffering? Is that going up or down as a result of this international military coalition's intervention?
I think that inevitably, because the Islamic State doesn't just see itself as a fighting group, but also as an actual state, and accordingly it takes over and has the workings of a state. So, for example, running of management of grain supplies and distribution of bread are very important, and also electricity and so on. The US is trying to degrade this infrastructure to try to damage the Islamic State. That is inevitably going to cause civilian suffering, particularly when you have grain silos targeting, particularly when you target, say, grain silos run by the Islamic State, or you target the oil infrastructure, because of course, the oil that ISIL extract isn't just used to export onto a black market. They also distribute some of it to locals for fuel. So yes, suffering in the short term is actually inevitable and will increase, particularly for those living in areas under ISIL's control.
Lawrence, on the point which Lena was mentioning there, are what the West calls the moderate factions of the Syrian opposition, are they getting enough support to really put into play the sort of strategy you were talking about of other groups filling any vacuum left by ISIL when it comes under pressure?
Well, I think they're trying to. For the longest time, as you know, they did not get the support because there was a fear that if you gave it to them, it would fall into the wrong hands. That's going to take quite a while. But if you neutralize ISIL and undermine not just their military and financial capability, but their narrative that somehow or another they're going to be able to establish this caliphate, I think that will buy you the time that you need. And eventually in Syria, you're going to have to come to some sort of political solution that guarantees that the Alawites will not, be persecuted, and there'll be a power sharing, and at some point Assad will have to step down. But that's going to take a while. Right now, you have an immediate crisis with ISIL, and you want to get them out of Iraq and prevent them from being able to go back into there or to keep expanding both militarily and economically.
But Lawrence, who is the U.S. counting on when we talk about the U.S. providing support and training and perhaps weapons, when it is seen that there is the FSA, for example, the Free Syrian Army, is not really a real army, is it? It's a loose association of fighting groups without a central command. Who is the West's ally here actually on the ground that it is counting on to fill any vacuum or void left by ISIL?
No, well, that's the problem. That's why it was mentioned before, you're starting to train them in Jordan and in Saudi Arabia, and that's a long-term process because, as I told somebody, when you talk about the moderate Free Syrian army, that reminds me of the Holy Roman Empire. It really doesn't exist in reality, and it's going to take a while to build that up. And so that's why President Obama has said, this is a long-term project. It's probably not even going to be completed while he's still in office over the next 2 years.
All right, Lena, one thing which Lawrence mentioned there was the immediate threat is from ISIL, and that needs to be dealt with. I wonder whether, is there a difference in terms of the narrative of what the real threat is? When you look at what some of the groups on the ground are saying, even those which are against ISIL are saying the real threat and problem has been going on for 4 years. It's a Syrian regime which keeps bombing and killing civilians. Is there a difference in perception and narrative here, which is part of the problem?
Absolutely. We are seeing so much coverage of ISIL atrocities that we have almost forgotten that the Assad regime has not stopped killing people from day one. So the problem with the Syrian regime is an ongoing one. And another issue that I always emphasize and we should all pay attention to is that the Assad regime contributed to the rise of ISIL in the beginning, because the Assad regime viewed ISIL as a convenient way to get rid of the Syrian opposition. First, the moderate opposition, then when Jabhat al-Nusra became part of the picture, ISIL was fighting that. And Assad turned a blind eye to ISIL, thinking that this would be a convenient way to tackle the opposition, and then he, and the regime could then eradicate ISIL. But now the genie is out of the bottle.
It's also giving him some legitimacy, is it not? It's giving him some international legitimacy because he is standing on the same side as an international coalition now in what he calls the fight against terrorism.
Well, absolutely. That was part of Assad's plan all along. He thought that he could then sell himself as a counterterrorism partner to the West, in a way, replicating what, the situation with Gaddafi of Libya was. All of a sudden he became a friend of the West. So Assad thought, why not do that? And it's a convenient way to get rid of the opposition. However, now, neither the Assad regime nor the West is able to completely control ISIL, and that's why we are where we are today. So anyone who thinks that ISIL is the immediate problem is missing the bigger picture, which is that we have another immediate problem, which is the Assad regime.
Ayman, in another sense, does the Syrian regime benefit on the battlefield? Because when these airstrikes are going on, the reports talk about even other anti-ISIL groups being hunkered down. They're the same groups which are fighting the Assad regime, like Ahrar al-Sham, the Tawheed brigades, the Truth brigades. These guys being hunkered down. Does that offer a military advantage to the Syrian regime?
I think when it comes to the Syrian regime's key objectives, which are namely to control, well, foremost at the moment, it's to try to seize complete control of Aleppo city, then yes, the long-term trend, and by long-term I mean over many months, it is going in his favor. The broader fight with ISIL trying to move to seize northern Aleppo province border areas. Yeah, and the fact that U.S. strikes aren't focusing on the regime. Yeah, that doesn't work to the rebels' advantage in the long run. And of course, also has to remember the U.S. airstrikes that have been hitting Jabhat al-Nusra, despite all this talk about Khorasan grouping. Reality is this Khorasan grouping isn't distinct from Jabhat al-Nusra, and Jabhat al-Nusra is well integrated in the overall rebellion and has good working relations with many groups, and that's actually partly driving the alienation. And of course, this complaint the US doesn't consult with the rebels, that's partly driven, I think, by the fact that the US is concerned that if it did inform rebels in advance of what it was going to do in terms of airstrikes, then it would give word to Jabhat al-Nusra, and then Jabhat al-Nusra could avoid being targeted by airstrikes.
Lawrence, help us to understand the current thinking of the US administration. Why doesn't it target the regime forces as well as ISIL right now? Why is that? There is obviously a conscious decision being made to go only after ISIL and Jabhat al-Nusra.
Well, again, I think it's in the short term, they don't. I mean, they've let them know that they, doing the airstrikes. And my guess is, though, obviously they're not going to say this publicly, that they've told them that if you launch, you get your air defense systems up or you launch planes against us, we're going to hit you pretty hard. And I think basically they want to deal with the immediate threat, which is not just ISIL, but also they're concerned about al-Nusra, and then come to some sort of agreement. Remember that if you go after Assad right now, then you can cause problems with Iran because you're working with Iran in Iraq. So it's a multifaceted operation, and you're trying to balance off all these competing interests. But I'll say it again, the most immediate threat the U.S. perceived was from ISIL, and in fact, they felt if they didn't get involved, ISIL might have overrun Iraq.
Does that undermine the credibility of this coalition and of the US in the eyes of many people in the area, though, who say we've been suffering under Syrian government bombardment for years? The UN has documented that the majority of the civilian casualties and the atrocities were being caused by the Syrian government, and yet there was no international intervention for that. Is that not an immediate threat to those people on the ground?
Well, again, it should have been an international intervention, not just a U.S. intervention, because basically it was a humanitarian catastrophe, you're right, but it wasn't threatening the whole region as ISIL was. And I think we have to, differentiate between the two. There's a lot of humanitarian catastrophes all over the world, but the United States is not going to get involved in every one, and I wish the international community would do more on these things. But again, if you take a look at the history of warfare, in World War II, we allied ourselves with Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union to beat Hitler. And again, that led to a 50-year Cold War after World War II. So you're always having to balance off these competing interests and make sure that you take care of your top objective first.
All right, Lena, do you think there'll be consequences back home for some of the Arab Gulf states which have joined this international coalition?
Unfortunately, yes. Gulf countries in general are very concerned that now that they have joined the coalition and are engaging in active combat or will against ISIL, that they will witness retaliation in their home, on home turf. And I think this risk is something carried by not just Gulf states, but all countries that are part of this coalition, because ISIL has sleeper members and sleeper cells actually across the world. And because ISIL will not be able to overwhelm the military campaign, regardless of the strategy used by ISIL against the campaign, it might choose to retaliate outside of Syria and Iraq instead.
Ayman, then, if we talk about measuring the success of this mission, can ISIL be measured at any point to have been degraded and destroyed? We've seen a war go on. We've seen a war go on against Al-Qaeda now for over a decade, and that was a war which was supposed to destroy that organization, and yet it's still ongoing.
I think degradation. Well, I think degradation to the infrastructure, damaging oil infrastructure, damaging grain silos, and so on, in an effort to roll back, degrade the Islamic State, that translates to economic suffering, and for the locals living in areas under ISIL control. And actually, that would have been true. That's also true of Iraq in particular, even if there were no airstrikes. I mean, the central government in Baghdad would cut off money, say, to much of Nineveh province, where in the northwest, where ISIL is dominant in many localities, including Mosul, and of course cut off fuel supplies, and that translates to hardship. And I think really in Iraq in particular, you find the Sunni Arab community really is going to suffer in the long run from all of this, regardless of international intervention or not. But as regards degradation, I mean, ultimately it depends on local willpower to roll back ISIL.
All right, I can see Lawrence wants to jump in with a comment. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Basically, the sound went off. I think this idea of defeating them is really not the right analogy. For example, we killed Hitler. Well, Hitler was killed 70 years ago. We still have pro-Nazi groups, in the United States. And so this idea that you're going to destroy Al-Qaeda or ISIL, no, you just want to make sure that they're not an immediate threat to the security of the region and to our allies and to the United States. But this is an ideology that basically the people in the region and the people, in the Muslim world have to turn against, and you can't beat it on the battlefield.
Well, Lawrence, I wonder, do you see any truth to the suspicion, since we're talking about, the people in the Arab world and Muslim world, that actually the United States and the West in general, they don't want to see a clear-cut victory in Syria. They want to see this conflict continue and just support each side directly or indirectly until they have to negotiate some kind of settlement in which the West would have more influence to play a role in the new order that would arise, rather than someone unilaterally march into Damascus and set it up themselves. Do you see any truth to that?
No, I mean, you end up basically with the balance, if you will, between your principles and your national interest. Unfortunately, the world got along fine with Assad. They got along fine with Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. But the fact of the matter is the people rose up. They're the ones who wanted the change. And at some point, if you can diminish this threat from ISIL, then you can work to make sure that the people, like they did in Tunisia. But look what happened in Egypt. The people rose up. They had an election. Now you got the military back in again. And so the real question is for the people there to make that decision themselves. And the United States and the international community can help, but we can't make it happen. I mean, we're powerful, but we're not omnipotent.
All right, very briefly, Lena, because we have about 20 seconds left. What is the alternative then if you're not a supporter of these airstrikes? Should this group just be left unchecked and unchallenged? Very briefly.
I'm not against striking ISIS. I just think what we're doing right now is not enough. So this campaign should be expanded militarily, and it should include a political, economic, and social strategy that goes parallel with it, and that should start immediately as well.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Let's thank our guests, Ayman, Lena, and Lawrence. And of course, thank you for joining us today on this episode of Inside Story. Of course, you can leave your comments and feedback at Facebook, for example, .com/AJ Inside Story. We're also on Twitter. Look for @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. From me and all the team, it's goodbye for now.